Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, historian and independent researcher, and I'll be your host. As the Canadian federal government embraces more and more central planning in pursuit of the destructive net zero transition, the privacy and rights of individual Canadians are under threat like never before. Most people believe the net zero transition is merely swapping one form of energy for another, but that is only one small part of it. In order to manage ever stricter carbon dioxide emission targets, the government needs to measure in finer detail every activity of every person. Today's technology enables such minute monitoring if governments choose to weaponize it for that purpose. Perhaps following the European Union's lead, it seems that Canadian governments, both federal and provincial, are moving in that direction by developing a digital ID. Basically, a digital ID could include any point of interaction between a citizen, government, and private business. And in this day and age, that is an ever-expanding list, from proof of vaccination to tax returns to banking. It's being sold to Canadians as a more efficient and convenient way of getting things done. But what is being lost in the process? How long before each individual receives an ESG score or a carbon score? Is personal carbon trading just around the corner? How soon before Canadian society emulates the Chinese social credit system? Joining me today to discuss Canada's slow motion slide towards a managerial surveillance state in social credit system is Professor Bruce Pardy. Professor Pardy has written extensively on environmental governance, ecosystem management, climate change, water policy, and civil liability. He is a professor of law at Queen's University, a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute, and executive director of Rights Probe. Thank you for joining me today, Professor Pardy, and welcome to the program.
Thanks, Tammy. Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, could you tell our listeners about this new organization, Rights Probe?
Yes, by all means. So Rights Probe is a division of the Energy Probe Research Foundation, and we are dedicated to exploring the shifting legal landscape. We have a legal system based upon the Western legal tradition in Canada, like the US, like the UK, and so on. And the ground has been shifting in that system for quite a while now, and it is reaching the stage where it is more difficult than ever to identify what the premises of the system are. We are giving up the principles of the Western system in exchange for other principles that one might call progressive or woke, if you like, or based upon critical theory. It's an alternative system of thinking, and that transition has not been completed yet, but it is well on its way. And so Rights Probe is dedicated to exploring this issue, trying to do its best to protect the Western legal tradition, and all of the exploring all of the issues that are related to that big picture. And of course, there are many, many of those.
Right, because one of the things I think of when you talk about that is how this is really an entire system change. It's not just tweaking policies here and there to, fight inflation or do all these other things. It's a complete system change, from our laws to how our politicians and government officials interact with the citizenry, an entire economic change, everything. And I think people have been sort of asleep in some respects, because they've just been focusing on certain policy changes rather than this is a large system change.
Absolutely. And the thing about the system change is that it's not done in a way that is announced. I mean, it's not like, one day we were one thing and the next day we brought in something else. This is something that's been happening little bit by little bit over a period of time. And even today, if you asked a lawyer or a judge or a law professor whether or not we still had many of the principles that are foundational to the Western legal tradition, they would say, well, of course, we have a presumption of innocence, we have the rule of law, we have separation of powers, we have all of those things. And sometimes that is true to some extent. But it is also changing, and what is changing is in part the meaning of those terms. So if you would ask a progressive law professor about the rule of law, that person would be likely to say, well, of course we have the rule of law. And then if you listen carefully to how they defined the rule of law, it might be very different than what you might expect. So it's the definitions of the terms themselves. It's the way the system works. It is all the policy changes put in place over a long period of time. This COVID period looks like it has brought a very sudden change in our legal norms. And in some respects, that's true, but it wasn't just COVID. This is sort of the logical extension of a whole developments that have been in progress for quite a while.
That's a really good point, that it's this logical extension of where we've been sort of sliding in this direction for some time, and it's only maybe put it into relief for people when it seems like such an extreme position to be forcing people to put something into their bodies if they don't wish it. And
that's right.
Yeah. So it's, and then when I really enjoyed your piece with Patricia Adams last week about the Freedom Convoy and this diminishment of our Constitution. We all thought that the Constitution protected certain rights and of the citizenry, and then it turns out, well, it seems to be arbitrarily applied depending on what the government wants to have happen.
Yes. So one of the most important questions in the law is not what, but who. So people think, well, what matters is what the rule is or what happens. And of course, that's very important too. But even more important than that is, well, who gets to decide what the rule means?
Right.
And if you have decision makers, whether they're in legislatures or in the executive branch or in the courts, who have a particular worldview of things, then they are going to take the rules, however they are worded, and interpret them and apply them in a way that fits the framework that they're working with, as opposed to the framework that some of the rest of us might believe was in place.
Right. It reminds me of a discussion I had with Stuart Meir about the environmental protesters attacking the Coastal GasLink pipeline.
Right.
And the activists have been there for some time, and there's been various injunctions brought against them to remove them from the area. And one judge said that the judge didn't want to basically get involved, didn't want to be on the wrong side of history by enforcing the injunction. And it was appealed, and then another judge came back and said, that's ridiculous. That's your job, is to enforce the law and not be worried about which side of the environmentalists you're going to be on. So as you say, it's being left up to individual judges or to be interpreting these things or defining things or deciding whether or not they wish to be on one policy side of an issue or another. And that doesn't seem right.
Well. So, but here's the trick there, though. That has always been the case. So whenever you have laws, whether they are common law or statutory laws or the Constitution for that matter, the system works by giving those laws to courts to interpret and apply to their particular cases. And so it has always been the case that words and phrases and provisions are subject to interpretation. When I was early in law school, one of the moments of disbelief that I remember sitting in a classroom in the early weeks, I remember sitting there thinking to myself, this can't be really the way it works. and I was reacting to the inherent uncertainty of the system, in which we have things written down, but there are inherent uncertainties and ambiguities embedded in what's written down. And so we rely on courts, and for that matter, the executive branch, the police, the crown prosecutors, the cabinet, and so on, to apply their own interpretive skills to decide in situations where there is ambiguity, what does this mean? And so, yes, we're in a period where we're subject to the inclinations of a whole bunch of decision makers, but that has really always been the case. It's just that today, more and more of our ruling class, if I can put it that way, are of a certain mindset, a new mindset, newish mindset, as opposed to the one that maybe a lot of us thought was very well established and beyond question.
That's a very good point. Thank you for clarifying that. I think a lot of people misunderstand perhaps how things work, and thank you so much for clarifying that. When you talk about the ruling class of a certain newish mindset, would you say this is ideologically driven? My sense is that a lot of people don't wish to discuss ideology in these things, and yet it seems to be following a certain ideology.
Oh, I think it's definitely ideological, especially if you define ideology in the broad sense, which I think is fair. Ideology in the worldview sense, not in the partisan political sense necessarily, but in the worldview sense. What is your mental furniture about how the world works? What are your premises and assumptions? And in that sense, everybody has an ideology, whether or not it's worked out. But yes, this is a shift in ideology, and again, the shift has been underway for quite a while, a long time, but it is a shift away from certain fundamental principles and towards a whole new set of other ones. And so, for example, this is a shift, I think, away from the Western idea of individual autonomy towards a collectivist philosophy where the interest of the individual can more easily be set aside in the interest of common good. That doesn't guarantee what's going to happen in any particular case, but the trend is away from worrying so much about the individual and being much more comfortable with the idea that we're all in this together, and the government has both the expertise and the legitimacy to tell us all what to do in the interests of that public good. That's a shift. At a certain point in the past, I think we would have said together that, hold on just a minute, why are you telling us what to do? We are individual people, and we'll decide for ourselves. Now, there was no magic moment in the past where it was all that way and not the other way. There's always been a tension between these two ideas, but the balance of that tension, I think, has severely shifted.
I agree completely. And I believe it's with the net zero transition, it's pushing it even that much further. Some people push back and say, well, like the trucker convoy, enough, just leave us alone. We don't want to have to be stopped at the border. You shouldn't be able to keep people prisoner in their own country and ban travel and so on, and have to meet all of these testing requirements when it's clear that, from the vaccine that it doesn't stop the spread, which was the whole motive apparently for bringing in these restrictions. It doesn't stop the spread, and it doesn't stop someone from getting the virus. So what's the point then of keeping these things? And when you have so many thousands of people push back and say, no, wait, just leave me alone. I want to live my life the way I want to and not have to listen to the government telling me to do all these little things and big things like you can't travel, you can't fly, you can't go on a train, you can't go on a boat. And then you see the government response. And the response is, well, we're going to tell you what's good for you and you're going to listen. So I agree completely that there's been this shift in the balance, and then when people do speak up, look at the reaction.
Right. So the proposition being argued by the truckers and their supporters and a whole bunch of other people, to the effect that, as you say, please, we just want to be left alone. That in itself is a challenge to what has become the established order. I mean, you can't accept that ask without undermining the project. And so we've gotten to the stage where asking to be left alone is actually a threat, which is why it cannot be accepted. Because if you accept the premise of that ask, the legitimacy of the rest of it starts to crumble. So, and to be fair, It has not been the case for a long time that people are entitled to just be left alone. We have a an aggressive, expansive managerial state, and we have had it for a long time, and it has been growing for a long time, and it seems to be insatiable. It has been telling us what to do for a long time in all kinds of ways. Everything is regulated, everything's directed, everything's taxed, everything's subsidized, everything is designed, everything's planned. This is, as I alluded to earlier, this is not a new thing. What was suddenly new, I think, was the ask itself. Like, hold on, enough. We don't want to be told what to do anymore. Please leave us alone. And because that was new, at least new in the sense of coming from a segment of society that up until that point had pretty much gone along with everything over a period of time. I think, and the degree to which it attracted an awful lot of support, because people recognize that, oh, you know what? I'm not alone in this. Here are people who are saying what I think, and thank God for that. And so there was a moment of coming together of people who actually were not with the program. And it was that moment, I think, that represented a problem for I'm going to call them the established order. And I don't just mean that in the sort of sitting government sense. I mean in terms of the multiple institutions and multiple authorities and multiple levels of government that we have that are built upon the premise that their role is to design, shape, plan society so as to protect us all from our own foolishness.
That's a really good way of describing it, because it's often that I hear, or at least the subtext of certain regulations and so on, is that you, Canadian taxpayer, don't know how to spend your money properly, and we can spend it better and direct it to the things that are more important, because otherwise you would just waste it on having trips or, spending the money the way you wish to. And so with the net zero transition and the new net zero policy that they announced the other day, 200 and some pages of all the different incentives and spending that they're going to do in order to do this incredibly complex and destructive rejigging of the Canadian economy by keeping oil and gas in the ground and embracing all of these new technologies and whatnot. It's basically telling Canadians, by 2035, we're going to tell you what kind of car you can drive. You're not going to be allowed a diesel truck. You're not going to be allowed a petrol engine vehicle of any kind. It's going to be electric. Sorry, that's the way it's going to be. And so people say, well, government has an obligation to protect the climate, and if people aren't going along, then they have to take those steps to persuade people to take the right actions and do the right thing or whatever. And then what I see for how they're going to push this for individuals is there's been lots of different articles sprinkled throughout the media over the past 18 months or so saying that individual behavior has to change. And how are we going to get individuals to change what they're doing? And for example, in The Guardian last year around the time of the COP26 meeting, Polly Toynbee wrote about personal carbon trading, and that the time has come for personal carbon trading, and that if everybody was assigned their own personal carbon budget, then they would live within their carbon means. And therefore, the government could set these targets and people would not be allowed to go beyond them unless they buy it from somebody else. And you think, well, how is that going to work? Well, if you have a digital ID and you have an app on your phone that's keeping track of all your purchases and all of the different things that you're doing that uses carbon or uses energy in some way, then they can keep track of those kinds of things. So I know that's farther down the road, maybe, but this infrastructure that's being developed from the vaccine passport and is now building towards this broader digital identification, I think there's a very real danger, a very real threat that every element of a person's life is going to be micromanaged maybe not by an individual, maybe through an AI or something, but it's going to be an app on their phone that's going to be keeping track of it all.
Yeah, sure. So there's a theory, I think, that goes like this, that if I can put it this way, this is my own wording. You know how Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message.
Mm-hmm.
There's another truism, I think, that goes something like, the machinery is the morality. In other words, technology comes first, and then our societal morals develop around it, rather than the other way around. It has not been the case that what happens is we decide what's morally correct, and then we determine what technology can be used, because it just doesn't work that way. Technology becomes ubiquitous. It becomes necessary in the sense that it is driving the economy, the production system, the survival, the prosperity of a society, and therefore the machine is moral. So let's try some examples. One might make the case about certain moments where slavery became immoral. One of the explanations offered, for example, for the American Civil War was, well, in the North was industrializing. The North had machines. The North didn't need slaves. And therefore, in the North, slavery was wrong. But in the South, they still had plantations, and the economy wouldn't work without them. That's the claim. And so the idea that slavery was wrong was not as quickly adapted in the South as it was in the North, because actually the North prospered better without slavery. In other words, the technological explanation comes first, and then the moral explanation comes second. Now, I'm not suggesting in any way that slavery isn't inherently immoral, but I am saying that as far as public opinion is concerned in one society compared to another one, it all depends upon what makes that society work in terms of what people think about what's okay. Let's take another situation. Let's say, let's take the automobile. In the early days of the automobile and the horse-drawn buggy coexisted. And at the time, I don't think anybody would have said, especially at the early introduction of the automobile, that, oh, by the way, the horse and buggy is going to become illegal. You're not going to be allowed to drive your horse and buggy on the road. It's just going to be the car. No one would have said that. No one would have needed to say that, I don't think. As time went on, of course, that became untenable, because the two modes of transportation are really incompatible in terms of their speed and so on. We have a system of automobile technology that causes a great deal of carnage every year. People die. People are injured. The numbers are pretty high. But nobody seriously suggests that we abandon the automobile, because that just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. We need it. Our society is now built around the technology, and those costs of the technology, both collectively and in terms of certain individuals who get caught in its clutches, oh well, that's just the way it has to be. So it's okay. It's moral because it's necessary. It's not the other way around. We don't decide whether it's okay first. If the technology comes along, then we use it. And that's, I think, what's happening here. In other words, I think the historical record shows, for the most part, there may be exceptions, but when you have new technology that provides you with some kind of efficiency or advantage, the technology will be used. And then the morality of the society will follow and adapt. And so the argument that, well, we can't have this because it's not right. I mean, I agree with you about that completely. But I don't think that argument is going to work.
I wanted to ask you, do you think that was the case for China under the Chinese Communist Party? Because they seem to have already an idea that they wanted to manage their people better, and the technology made that easier to do.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And you can point to other places where it hasn't been a result of technological change. I mean, you could talk about probably the Russian Revolution, for example. So this is not a singular kind of explanation for things. But I think it does explain why when you get technology, it gets applied rather than being thought about first to decide, whether or not you won't really want it. So
That's
it
a
is
good
not
point.
always,
Yeah.
I think it's fair. It's not always the case that technology always drives the change, but it's very hard to avoid the change when technology does drive something.
Do you think that the moral explanation for the West in this case to utilize the technology is the climate emergency? Is that the excuse being given for something they wanted to do anyway, maybe?
I doubt it very much. And the reason that I doubt it is that the climate emergency and especially the actions that they are proposing to take are without substance. It's a shell game. It doesn't make any sense. So let's assume for a moment, to give the benefit of the doubt, just for the sake of the argument, let's assume that there really is a climate problem, that the increasing amounts of carbon dioxide of the atmosphere are what's driving the climate change, and that the solution is to reduce humanity's carbon emissions. Let's assume that's true. If that is true, then what the Canadian government and other Western governments propose to do still doesn't make any sense, because it's not a universal program that's being followed. And the greatest amount of growth in carbon emissions comes from Asia, China and India in particular, but not just those countries. And the amount of reductions that are going to occur in a place like Canada are dwarfed by the increases in these other places. So the pretense that it is the Canadian government's role to protect the world from climate change is a joke. Like, it's a complete and utter joke. Anybody who understands elementary arithmetic can figure out that it doesn't make any sense at all. And so all you're left with, essentially, is moral righteousness. It's a virtue signal that really has no effect upon anything. And so it'd be very hard to come to the conclusion that the actual climate crisis, assuming that there is one, is what's driving this. Itself doesn't make any sense, because they're not even obeying that. If they really thought that the climate was a real problem, then they presumably would adopt an approach to the problem that actually had the potential to achieve the solution as they have defined the problem. But they're not even doing that.
No.
So for me, the climate thing is a pretense for an ideology, for other kinds of governance mechanisms to be put in place. And I don't mean this necessarily in the in the literal conspiracy sense. I don't think this is a product of a small bunch of people gathering in a room and saying, right now, all you people, what are we going to do? It is instead much more insidious than that. It's the spread of a set of ideas about society, about government, about how people should be directed, about who knows best. All kinds of things, all kinds of ideas are part of this that have taken over the culture slowly, insidiously. It's been a quiet revolution. I don't think it's been driven by any particular person or persons, but a lot of individuals have had a big role in pushing it. But it's been an organic thing, and that's partly why it's so difficult to combat.
Exactly. Yeah. Especially if you consider it to be something like a movement. So a movement has this, as you say, an organic way of people join. There's ebbs and flows. There's people who may have other agendas that join in because they see it as a means to an end, and so on. And so there's this sort of constant fluctuation within the movement. And sometimes there'll be more authoritarian groups may seem to be having more control, and then you'll have other ones who then take over and are more accommodating and so on. But I think that's the big difficulty is everybody's looking to find one individual to blame or a small group of people to blame, but it's far more integrated into our society because there's been this cultural shift that has allowed for the change in ideas and how our economy ought to work, or how our political system ought to work, or how our judiciary ought to work. So once that cultural shift happens and reaches a critical mass, then all of these other things start to fall into place in their view as well.
Yes, certainly. And this is I think you can identify a whole bunch of causes or origins to this. One of them, I think, is critical theory.
Yeah.
Critical theory being essentially an academic discipline that sometimes been described as a neo-Marxist discipline. I think a lot of its adherents would object to that, but it, as far as I know, and I'm not a critical theory theorist, but from what I understand, it grew up sort of in the aftermath of World War II. Some academics wanted to figure out why Marxism hadn't caught on in the West. And they ditched Marx's focus on economic conflict, between the upper and lower classes. But they kept certain aspects of his framework. And critical theory grew up to be it's not a theory. It's not a theory at all. It's an agenda or a proposition or an argument, an ideology. Basically says that Western society, Western culture is based upon oppressive power relationships. And those power relationships don't exist between upper and lower class, which was Marx's theme. Instead, they exist between identity groups. And this, of course, there's an enormous literature on critical theory, and a lot of it is self-contradictory. There's lots of theorists that don't agree with each other, and there's a lot of schools within the umbrella, and so on. So there's obviously a lot to it that I'm skipping over and oversimplifying. But essentially, you have this theory making its way through the university into various kinds of disciplines, sociology, any discipline that typically that ends with studies, women's studies, fat studies, so on studies, is often a critical theory outgrowth. And then you have it once it's taken over sort of the arts and humanities, which it has done. Then the next was the professional schools, and it's now working on the sciences.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, universities are educating generations of students who are going out into the workforce and taking critical theory with them. And so, while at one point, this and we can say essentially, for lack of a better term, critical theory in the university has become wokeism in society.
Yeah.
And you have all these people now who have gone to university who are running the country in government and in HR departments and corporations and in institutions and in media who think this is the way it is and are reflecting the premises of critical theory in their work.
Yeah.
Sometimes because they are true believers, and sometimes because that's just the way they think the world is. And the climate crisis and the reaction to COVID and the growth of equity, diversity, and inclusion policies everywhere, and so on and so forth, all the way down the line, can all be linked to critical theory. Perhaps not just critical theory, because as I say, there are probably multiple causes and origins of all of this, but it's certainly one of the leading candidates for the forces that have led us to where we are.
Absolutely. It's this sort of almost poisoning the well in some extent, to some extent, and then it branches through and creates those different networks that you talk about throughout our society, and so then it flows through eventually everything. And then when you look at so we have the diversity, equity, and inclusion things that are being brought in for schools, government jobs, universities, and so on, requirements that have to be met in order to get a scholarly grant or something. And then you have the larger ESG framework for businesses, and which have components of the diversity, equity, inclusion elements in it, but they add the environment, right? So
right. Go ahead. Yeah. Well, the theme here is, though, that one of the things that's reflected in all of the things that you're listing is that critical theory is essentially an anti-Western doctrine.
Yes.
And an anti-Enlightenment doctrine.
Yes.
And the Enlightenment includes all kinds of things that you and I would sort of take as self-evident. And people have a hard time getting their head around the idea that these things are being rejected. So, for example, things as fundamental as rationality, evidence, consistency. I mean, a lot of the arguments against a lot of these policies is, look, you're not being consistent. You say this, and then you do that. That doesn't make any sense. And that's true. I mean, there's inconsistency all over the place. But the point that's being missed is they don't care about that. They've rejected consistency as something that's important. If you come along and you say, look, there's no evidence of this and you're being inconsistent, then the reaction is likely to be, oh, you're just being Western. You are showing your privilege by relying upon arguments that only those people privileged in Western societies use. Get with the program.
Yeah. To me, it's been this inversion of values and principles, and it goes through everything. So, for example, when you say Enlightenment values such as rationality, evidence, and consistency, I would posit the inversion that's circulating now is, instead of rationality, we have absurdity. Instead of evidence, we have subjectivity. Instead of consistency, we have contradictions. And if you look at the microcosm of how energy and environment work, all of those things are there. I mean, it makes no sense to think that you could run an entire modern economy, a modern technological economy, on renewable energy. It doesn't work. And there's been lots of engineering studies to say it doesn't work. From a physical point of physics, it doesn't work. And yet they're doing it anyway, right? And so when you look at all of these different things, there's inherent contradiction in the environment movement. They talk about that they want to lower the footprint of land use, but that happens with using hydrocarbons. But if you look at the land use footprint of renewables, it's enormous. It makes no sense.
No, it doesn't make any sense. It makes no sense.
Support it anyway. Makes no sense.
But the way, I mean, I spend my time doing this myself, but a lot of people try and spend their time sort of working it out. Like working out the inconsistencies and trying to figure out, well, what? Let's try to make sense of this. And in many respects, that's a waste of time and missing the plot. It doesn't make sense.
It's not supposed to make sense.
It's not supposed to make sense.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, some people have said, look, the way to make sense of critical theory and all of its extensions in the realm of public policy is to think of it as adolescent, to think of it as emotional, to think of it as childish. Think of it as though you're dealing with a child, because the child is motivated by how he feels and insists that a certain thing must be the way it is because he's sure, because that's the way he feels. That's the way it works.
Right.
But the real kicker, though, is that the children are in control.
Yes.
And you better believe they won't put up with not being in control.
So can I then link this to the movement here for a digital identification and how that fits in with all of this? Because the EU has been talking about this since before COVID. And it was supposed to be one of the fundamental pillars of the European Green Deal. The first part was the whole environment, biodiversity, and all this kinds of thing. But the second pillar, to hold it all up, was supposed to be this digitalization of everything. And in March 2020, Ursula von der Leyen gave a speech to a group of small business owners or whatever. And she said it's not fair that big tech companies like Facebook and whatever have access to all of this data that people generate, that governments need to have access to this data so that they could better understand their citizenry and make money off of it, really.
Right.
But I think it goes beyond making money. I think maybe that was just something that she said. Maybe she actually believes that. I don't know. But if you look at the things that they want to add into what will require a digital identification, one of the EU proposals is that you will need a digital ID to log on to the internet. And then every website you go to, every comment that you make, everything will be tracked within your digital ID. So if you say the wrong thing, you know, that's in contradiction or against critical race theory or whatever the fashionable virtue signaling thing is, then you'll be throttled from your digital ID. It might mean that you aren't allowed to access certain things. Maybe you won't get a good enough bank interest rate or something like that. I mean, they want to tie it into lots of different things so that these tendrils then go into all that you do and reflect a certain social credit score, right?
Yes. Many, many years ago, and I wish I could track it down. I haven't been able to find it. But many, many years ago, when I was in high school, I read a short story, a science fiction short story, way before its time, about a man in some future time who goes and uses his electronic identification to interact with some kind of, a portal to get service for something. And the machine takes his ID and informs him that the ID is owned by somebody who is dead. And so they're keeping it because the person was obviously using it, illegally. But he's not dead. That was his ID. So now he's without his electronic ID. And in the society in which he lives, there's no way to interact with the government, with service people, with provision of goods, food, drive your automobile. You need your ID. And he hasn't got it because the machine said he was dead. And it's a very short story. It basically tells the beginning of the end of his life because there's nothing he can do about it.
Because there's nothing he can do about it. Yeah.
And that's the kind of situation we're going to fall into. I don't mean the particularities of that story, but the situation where your digital ID and all your personal information is going to be held in one spot, and you're going to need it to do anything, to pay for groceries, to renew your driver's license, to go to the hospital, to get on a plane, to drive your car, to get credit, a mortgage at the bank. And it all seems to a certain set of the population to be a logical and convenient extension of what we have. I mean, there's a generation, and of course, not everybody in a generation thinks the same way, of course, but there's a generation that lives online and pays with whatever the electronic wallet is or et cetera, wants to. And I think they see absolutely no reason why we shouldn't do this because everything, the whole life is online already.
Yeah.
When you speak to a person of a certain age, on average, about being careful about their information online, to be private, to watch their privacy, sometimes they'll look at you like you are out of your mind. Like, what are you talking about? I don't want to be private. I want everybody to see. That's the whole point. That's why I'm posting my life on Instagram. Right. I want the attention. And everybody knows about me already anyway. I want likes. I want approval. It's the way to get status. It's the way for some people to make a living. When you do a new website for your company, the company wants to know how many hits you got. You want to be seen. And the idea that you shouldn't want to be seen and known in all the various permutations of your life is foreign to some people. And they have a trust in government in the same way that they trust the big tech companies with everything they do and everything they know. And it's very hard to get people to understand what the danger here is.
So how do we raise awareness then to explain or at least make people aware that there are dangers to this and that maybe we should think twice about going down this road?
You're talking about a certain kind of education, and that's worth doing. It's certainly worth trying, but it's a very steep mountain. I mean, did people not read 1984 in high school? Did they not read Brave New World? Have they not seen The Matrix? I mean, there are all kinds of extrapolations to make from all kinds of really great stuff that has been written, both fiction and nonfiction. It's all out there to be read and seen and understood. It's available. It's just that people are either not inclined, or they don't want to see it, or they don't want to extrapolate that way, or they have personal interests that make them not want to interpret things in that manner. There are all kinds of reasons, but it's very hard to change the mental furniture of multiple generations in a society. I'm not saying it's not worth trying, but it's a very hard thing to do.
Do you think part of the problem maybe is that even if you point out these concerns and that there's serious implications to going down this path, how do you get the message out there when there's been such an unprecedented level of government influence on media, never seen before in peacetime? And I mean, the media isn't even covering the testimony and hearings that are going on about the implementation of the Emergencies Act. I mean, Blacklock's is the only one that's really covering it, but
Right.
that's a bit of a, I hate to say it, I love Blacklock's, but it's a bit of a niche news site, and it's certainly not being picked up on the legacy television media, which I know a lot of people still watch the 11 o'clock news or watch the National or whatever, but that's not being covered. So I agree we need to help raise the awareness, and I'm just and it's an education thing, but what's the best way forward at this point before a critical mass is reached? And
Yeah,
I would almost argue we're there, but
well, I hope you're right. I hope you're right. I don't have a silver bullet. I don't have a prescription. We just have to keep doing what we're doing and using alternatives to the legacy media, who are basically captured. Yeah. And captured, not captured literally, but also captured ideologically. There seems to be a prevailing belief that's consistent with critical theory and all the other things that makes them believe that certain viewpoints are wrong, and therefore they should not get coverage. And you see how that dovetails with critical theory. Critical theory does not embrace debate. It's not. So let's just distinguish this. I didn't mention this at the time, but people get mixed up between critical theory and critical thinking, with two completely different things. Critical theory is a set of premises that you must accept or you are wrong, essentially.
Yeah.
And so the idea that we would debate things in a rational way with evidence is Western, which is why both in the media and in academia and all other kinds of places that the tradition of debate is going to, because it's a Western thing. So it must be rejected. And you don't want to give credence and legitimacy to the view that is wrong. That's the way this works.
Yeah.
But in terms of mounting an attempt to to expose people to the point of view that we're describing. I mean, number one, you need all hands on deck, and you need all of the alternative possibilities to be used to their greatest extent. And people are turning to them, I think, and that's the good news. If we didn't have the internet and alternative news sources and videos and podcasts and outlets for articles to be published other than in the mainstream media, then frankly, I'm not sure that we would understand what was going on during COVID. But the word has gotten out to an awful lot of people. And so it does work. So that's the upside. So this technology, which has caused an awful lot of trouble, does have this upside. And, we have to use it to the greatest extent that we can.
That's an excellent point. And I think in terms of how the Freedom Convoy really, I think, woke a lot of people up to what's the road we're on, because when people were watching the coverage, and the coverage didn't match the people they knew who were there, or, right. They were actively searching out these independent journalists who were walking around with their GoPros or whatever, filming, live streaming what was happening. And it just didn't match. It didn't match the narrative that was coming out in the press. And so I think a lot of people were questioning, okay, like why are they covering it in that way when the reality is something else entirely? Why are they doing this? And then when they froze the bank accounts of people who had just chipped in to help maybe somebody they knew who made the drive and whatever, and then they started freezing bank accounts, and it was like, whoa, wait a second. Why does the government have the right to do that for a peaceful protest? So, and then we have the censorship bill, the internet censorship bill that's before the House. And I don't know, with the NDP support, I think it's going to get passed. And then what? And then all of these independent great sources that we have out there that people have found because of the Freedom Convoy. Now, are they going to be censored? Are they going to be people unable to access them? I don't know. I think, yeah.
In some ways, the greatest obstacle that people face is their own disbelief.
Yes.
It's very hard for some people to get their head around that what you're describing is actually happening. So it can't be right. It can't be right because that would mean that a lot of things that they believe to be true are wrong. And that's a very uncomfortable thing.
It's not just uncomfortable. It also, I think, it puts people in a position where they might have to do something about it. And well, yes. that's a big responsibility. And a lot of people don't know what it is they can do about it. And so then I'm just going to ignore it, keep my head down, try not to get, deplatformed or whatever, but just keep going. And I think part of it also goes back to what you had said before. We have all of these really cool sci-fi shows out there showing the dangers of this type of society, Minority Report and so on.
Yes, right. Yeah.
And then people are like, it's surreal. When it starts to happen, it's like that was a movie. It can't be real. That was a movie. So yeah, and then you have to do something about it. And maybe we're at the point where you have to find ways to give people something they can do to fight back. And I think that's maybe why the Freedom Convoy was so popular across the nation, because people felt like, I can do this. I can support this. And here's people standing up for us.
Right. Yes, I agree. But it is difficult when people come to you and ask, well, what, I think I see it. What should I do? And it's very hard to know what to tell them to do in concrete terms because the thing is set up so that it's very hard to do anything about it.
Right. Yeah.
The thing that they should do, I think, is number one, to continue to figure it out for themselves, and number two, to try and gently explain it to all the people that they're close to in their lives. And number three, then to act in accordance with what it is they think that they know to the extent that they can. And that doesn't mean destroying yourself, doesn't mean putting yourself out into a position of being canceled for no reason. I mean, you have to be strategic about this. But on the other hand, not to carry on in such a way that the thing gets its ability to carry on through you. There's a great line from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, of course. He talks about the lie, right? The lie that, let the lie come into the world. Let the lie even triumph, but not through me. And if people could manage to do that, they don't have to fix it. They just have to not be part of it. That would make a big difference.
That's an excellent point. I remember reading that, and it's so true. Well, thank you so much for your time. I know that you're very busy, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me about these issues. I think you've given us some hope that there's ways that people can resist this, and I hope we're able to do so. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Tammy. I appreciate it very much. I had a good time.
Thank you very much.